It's time to dive in on, those Dos Equis commercials, the most interesting man in the world. Well, the most interesting prospect in the 2024 NFL draft was Qwan'tez Stiggers, and we have someone that has a little bit more insight into that New York Jets draft selection. Let's roll.
It is unequivocally the Super Bowl for New York Jet fans.
Field Yates, baby. Field gosh darn Yates. Let's bring him on the show.
Come on, people. Connor Rogers is joining the show. What's up, Connor? But Trevor gosh darn Sycamore, baby. For me, personally, my favorite New York Jet of all time.
Wow, it's great to be on. What an intro that was right there.
Paul, nobody does an intro like you, man.
Paul, you give the best intro of literally any podcast that I've ever been.
I'm gonna lose my gosh darn bananas. Hey, what's going on, everybody? Paul Liston Jr., a.k.a. Boy Green. I'm the New York Jets digital reporter for Heavy.com. Welcome to Boy Green Daily, a daily New York Jets video show. Listen wherever you get your friggin' podcast, people. Let's bring on a very special guest. And we were planning this one, trying to get this one ready to roll. And, this is going to be well worth the conversation. There's no doubt about it. And let's go right to her. This is Jori Epstein, the friggin' senior NFL reporter for Yahoo Sports, gracing us with their presence. What's up, Jori?
It's great to be here, Paul. Thanks so much for having me. And as everyone in your intro said, what an intro.
Okay, cool. So I want to just keep that train rolling. As soon as the next person goes, that was kind of iffy. I'm like, all right, thanks, everybody. And that'll be exit stage left for me. So I appreciate that. The royalty check will be sent after the interview. And Jori, so your job, as I see here, senior NFL reporter for Yahoo Sports. I'm curious, how do you determine the stories you get to cover? Because there's a lot happening in the NFL all the time. I'm kind of curious that off the top rope.
Yeah, it's a great question, Paul, because for the first 7 years of my career, I was based in Dallas, and I would do national stories here and there, especially when I worked for USA Today, but I was primarily reporting on the Cowboys. I always had a home base. There was always a lot of interest. And then when I moved to New York a year ago, I was like, okay, well, now I'm responsible for 32 teams. We've only got a few NFL reporters in-house. This isn't like ESPN where you have someone on every team. So how do you go about it? And I would say it's kind of a mix of what does the news cycle dictate, which sources are getting back to us, what interests me, where are there interesting stories. I try and consume a lot of NFL content, be that podcasts or articles, to get inspired and ideas. It's funny, recently I started a list of just running ideas of potential stories. I've had versions of this before, and I told my bosses, if I have 25 ideas on them and 24 of them stuck, but one's great, that's worth this list. And so there's really kind of one thing leads to the next. You're working on one story and it leads to the other. But a lot of times it's just research and seeing what comes out of it and letting conversations flow to lead me on the way.
So from what you said, it seems like you have a lot of creative control from that standpoint, or trust from Yahoo Sports in you, that whatever you determine, whatever your journalistic antenna says, hey, I think this is kind of interesting. They're like, all righty, let's roll, baby. So let's do it. So is that kind of the feeling you kind of get as you cover the National Football League?
Yeah, I would say that's accurate. My bosses and I might discuss an idea, but I would say over 99% of my stories come from my ideas, and the ones that don't might be hey, Russell Wilson signed with the Steelers. What angle do you have? And then I go and find the idea. But it's very rare in this role that they're telling us what to write. They're much more into empowering my colleagues, Charles Robinson, Charles McDonald, and I, to go and find our story ideas.
That's a great flex. A freaking super team, a dream team, you could say, is happening over there at Yahoo Sports. And, I could bring you on for any number of reasons. You're spectacular. But in this specific case, there is a full link to your article on Qwan'tez Stiggers in the description down below that you guys can read for Yahoo Sports. It's a spectacular piece. And I'm curious, how much banging on the table did you have to do for this Qwan'tez Stiggers story? It's fascinating on the surface.
Yeah, I didn't have to bang on the table much. So the way I started with this is, okay, I'm based in New York. Well, I went through the Giants, the Jets, the Commanders, the Patriots, basically all of the teams within a train ride distance, and started making lists of their draft picks and then trying to look up each of those draft picks and like, hey, what's interesting? Because it's not necessarily like who's going to be the most productive on the field if they don't have an interesting story and or access to give us. And so when I came across Qwan'tez's story, which I think Jets fans probably knew like in depth before I knew in depth, but I was like, this is crazy. Like, we know that he didn't play college football. We know that he came from the CFL, but like, how does that process even work? How does someone like that end up on an NFL team? Why, if he's played in the pro league, is he going through a draft process like the rest of these amateur players? I guess you could debate how amateur they are with the NIL rules these days. And then, by the way, how common is that? And so I like reached out to NFL research and I was like, can you tell me, like the research wing of the league office, and said, can you tell me since 1970, which is when most of their data goes back to, how many players have been drafted? How many of those did not play in any college football games? And of those, how many were American? And so I found that of 14,155 draft picks, all but 5 played college football. So that's 99.965%. And of the 5 who didn't, 3 of them weren't from America, and the other one was a defensive tackle in the 90s. And so just the statistical unlikelihood of what Qwan'tez is doing is remarkable. And there's a confluence of personal and historical and I guess some degree of luck factors that led into this. But this is not like oh yeah, he's got a really unique journey. We hear that so often. The numbers show this guy has a unique journey.
Yeah, and Jori, I do want to get into that because I find it interesting, and it may have been a little bit in your answer there. So you mentioned that a lot of Jet fans may have known the story already because there was this uniqueness factor to it. But I'm curious on your decision to tackle it, because I've heard this. There was a few people that have done wonderful stories on Stiggers pre-draft, like that people were catching up on after the fact. And I heard a few reporters that cover this current Jets team go, well, I can't do it any better than insert Joe Blow did it a few years ago. So I'll just kind of, hey, guys, check out this story for more details. What led you to go the extra mile and say, whoa, okay, sure, some people have told the story, but Jori Epstein hasn't told this story. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's such a great question because I did kind of battle with that because initially when I pitched this to my bosses, I told them the story and I said, look, people explained the challenges that he's gone through. His dad was in a car accident. He was in a coma. He lost his father right when he was going up to college. And oh, by the way, they didn't have a football season because of COVID. So he drops out. His mom finds him the fan-controlled football league, which leads to the CFL. So there's a part of me that says, while I am passionate about human stories and humanizing players in the NFL, maybe I should more focus on from the league level, what does this look like? So I talked to scouts from 4 teams in addition to the Jet scout who I quote in there. And I said, when did you first find out about Qwan'tez Stiggers? When did he first get on your radar? How did you go about watching film? I mean, I had a coach tell me that usually it takes him like 5-6 hours to watch a prospect at his position, but it took him 12 hours to do Qwan'tez because he can't just say, okay, defense, okay, plays with him in it. Like he had to go look through every play, figure out which plays were defense. Oh, by the way, he doesn't know CFL rules that well. Then he has to clip them himself because so many of these college games are already loaded into their systems. Well, the CFL games were not. And then you had the scouts. I have one scout in that story from an AFC team who told me, I showed up to the Senior Bowl, or not Senior Bowl, sorry. I showed up to the Shrine Bowl. I knew something about every player there. And there's this guy I'm trying to interview, and I know nothing about him. I haven't watched his film. I don't know his personal backstory. So I'm just like, hey, tell me about yourself, like completely honestly, because I do not know. And so I thought that the league anomaly was almost as interesting. And that was what led me to pursue it. But then once I was able to interview Qwan'tez directly at the Jets facility, I went out to one of their OTA practices a few weeks ago, and I got a one-on-one that day with Qwan'tez, with his position coach, Tony Oden, with the Jonathan Stiegel, the scout on him. And we talked also to Brian Olberg and Sauce Gardner sort of about what they were seeing. And so I was like, okay, well, once I talked to them, I got a little more of a sense of why the personal story is still relevant. And one of my favorite interviews I did for the story was, it had been told multiple times that Qwan'tez worked at a truck wash, which, by the way, Blue Beacon wants you to know, they are not a car wash, they are a truck wash. That is very important to them. And I don't even say that like making fun of them. It was interesting to me to learn a little bit about this culture. But I said, well, a lot of people have told this story through his family, which is interesting, but it's been done. why don't I call his boss from the car wash? So I looked up, I was like, okay, what is your boss's name? He was like, Travis. And I'm like, okay, at Blue Beacon. He's Blue Beacon, Atlanta. So I find the Blue Beacon website. I find I think it was like the West Atlanta location. I see a number for it and I see the GM is Travis. I don't have a last name. And I just call the truck wash and say, can I talk to Travis? And they're like, who is this? And I told them I was a reporter for Yahoo. I was working on a story on Qwan'tez. He mentioned how important Travis was to him. Could he talk? And he called me back a little bit later. And I was like, okay, walk me through what this car wash was like. Or sorry, wow, here I am committing this in.
Right,
walk me
wash,
through what it was like for the truck wash. Walk me through what a day at work would be. Well, how many trucks would he wash in a day? Is he using a soap gun? Is he using a rinse gun? Like, explain all of this to me so that we can paint this picture and paint the detail. Because I think so often in journalism, a lot of things are cliche when you say them, but once you have the color to actually paint the picture, when you show rather than tell, that's how we take something from cliche to like, wow, this guy was doing this, what was it, 3 days, 5 days, 3 days before the draft and 5 days before he got drafted. Like, that's crazy. I am willing to wager, I'm not sure about this, that there is no other member of this year's draft class who was working at a truck wash the week of the draft. I'm not saying ever in their life, but the week of the draft, knew they were going to get drafted. And 29 scouts came to his pro day, and he's still doing this.
Yeah. So, and that's how you start the story. Again, the full, the link to the full article is down in the description down below. I can't recommend it enough for reading. That's how you start it, that 3 days before the draft, Qwan'tez Stiggers returns to where, and not just returns like, hey, everybody, signing, autographs, kissing babies, like for a shift of 4.5 hours in length. And as I read it, and I went like, oh, wow, what did Qwan'tez Stiggers' contract ends up being? Because he was the last pick in the 5th round. He's got a $4 million rookie contract. Like, it's not like he needed the shekels of whatever he was making at this institution for this. But what was that? What about it that he wanted, that he felt so compelled to say, hey, I got to finish my shift there? He seems like he had a very special connection to this truck wash.
Yeah, I do think that. I think it became a home for him over the last few years since he lost his father, since he left school, as he was navigating his football journey. I think it became with friends and family. I think there was something about, hey, I can't control everything in my football journey, but I can control my ability to bring in some income for his family during those hours. And sort of like it looks like I'm going to get drafted, but I'm not there yet. So I don't want to just put all my eggs in one basket yet. And I do think that was really meaningful. I mean, he told me that when he came back after the draft and Travis was like, hey, you're not working here anymore, like, go play football. He's like, that hurt a little bit. It hurt to get my separation notice or termination, because Quanto said that he was at the truck wash for most of those moments in his life. When he found out about the fan-controlled football league, he was at the truck wash when the assistant general manager of the Toronto Argonauts reached out to say, like, hey, we want to offer you a contract. And now he was there the week of the draft. So I do feel like it was a place where it was the geographic home for so many of his memories along his football journey thus far.
Again, so fascinating. And also in the story, you quote Stiggers' agent, Fred Lyles, that he gives kind of, and this is what all agents do when they're speaking with their prospects. The prospect's like, all right, lay it to me. What's my range? Where do you believe I'm going? And he says in the story, 3rd to 5th round, that's where I think you're going. And like I said, he ends up being the last pick in the 5th round. I'm kind of curious. So there's all these teams, as you also quote in the story, that were interested in him way back when, and I want to get back into that for the initial CFL when the windows opens up, and NFL teams are like, we'll sign him right now, screw the draft, and then they find out that ultimately he will be draft eligible, so they have to go in a different way. Do you think teams outthought themselves that ultimately, you get this 3rd to 5th round range, but sure, that's an agent's perspective on where he believes the player is going to go. The Jets get him, and I've heard from a lot of NFL people after the fact, like, blast, the Jets got us. Like, that it's almost like I was trying to reference it to like holiday traffic. We all plan to leave on a certain day, but then like we kind of outthink it, and you should have left on this day. Is that how it is with the Qwan'tez Stiggers? Because the story is interesting. His path is fascinating, but there's production there. Like, he was the CFL Rookie of the Year. Like, it's not like he was some guy. Was it outthought the process here? The Jets just took him earlier than the rest of the general NFL thought they were going to. What happened there, in your understanding?
Yeah, there were definitely questions of like, is this? I guess teams were trying to understand how to translate the hype of 29 scouts and coaches, 29 teams showing up to his pro day. Now, granted, a lot of them were in the Atlanta area for a Georgia Tech or Georgia State pro day, but they still chose to come out there. And you still had Tony Oden going there for a private workout a few days later. I think that it's challenging because on one hand, you see these ball skills, you see so much potential, you see the ceiling, and ball skills and those instincts are something that's harder to teach than perhaps the technique. On the other hand, you just have a player who is so raw, like especially coming out of the CFL. I think teams feel differently about giving someone a undrafted free agent spot, or even a free agent, forget the drafted, if had they signed him back in December and January when teams thought they could, someone about like, hey, we want to see if you could work first. There's, especially for general managers and front office people, you're almost like staking your reputation on a guy in a different way when you draft him. And so I think that there were teams trying to figure out, was he just too raw for us to be willing to stake our claim on him? And even now, I mean, when I was at Jets camp and I talked to Brian Ulbrich, I said, how do you go about retraining a brain like Qwan'tez? Is because he was playing CFL rules. He was playing on a CFL field. He had different rules that he had to operate on and different instincts to make those 5 interceptions he had in the league last year. And Ulbrich said, he was like, look, I don't think this is a matter of retraining. I think this is just training. It's a blank slate because you don't, college and NFL rules are different too. But we're not retraining a guy. We're training a guy for the NFL level. And I also think there's a degree to which, okay, let's say those guys play 3 seasons. You have people playing 5 seasons coming out of the draft this year. Well, this is a guy who played in 1 shorter season with different rules. Like that's just it's just such a small sample size of football. And on top of that, his high school wasn't a particular football powerhouse. It was a small school. They didn't even have enough guys for like 11-man football a lot of the time. And so I think there's just so much rawness there that teams had to make sure they felt like they had the infrastructure and also the patience to go and develop him. Because if you're going to put a 5th round draft pick as opposed to undrafted free agent, you also have to consider where you are in the life cycle of your team. Do you need to win this year? Do you already have the defensive backs you need this year? Like that, what needs do you have? And so I think that all that factored in.
And interesting enough, despite the long-ranging road year, Qwan'tez Stiggers just turned 22 in January. So, like, I know it's a massive thing in the NBA when we're talking about age and guys coming in and what's the runway year. That despite everything he's been through, 22 isn't that bad. I mean, the Jets have drafted 24 and 25-year-olds before in the draft, where you're like, whoa, okay, what is the run here of availability? That's fascinating on Stiggers, and that's something I also took away in your column, that Stiggers is not a transformation project, but a developmental project. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, I meant that this isn't someone who you're trying to take from the CFL game and convert him to football the way you might do with a rugby player. I mean, we've seen Australian guys and rugby players as people from other sports needing to learn football. This is a guy who just has a very limited base, and his base is limited in high-level football and it's limited in CFL football. And so neither of those are going to be what's ultimately deciding it. And so instead it's, okay, where is your footwork right now? How do you make it more efficient? How do you make sure that you're reading the coverages in the right way? I mean, I think it was Qwan'tez who was telling me in the CFL, it was like, here's the play. This is what I do. Like, there's one thing I do. And now it's like, I need to make certain checks. I need to make adjustments. I need to read what the receiver's doing or what's happening in the motion to make sure I understand. On the other hand, in the CFL, guys are running towards you before the snap. And here, they're just chilling out. So they're not moving. They might be going a little bit of lateral motion, but there's not forward motion advancing towards you. And so the way Qwan'tez described it to me was CFL pre-snap was commotion, and this is like slow commotion, which also sounded like locomotion, which I find very entertaining every time I read or say it.
Yeah, that's funny. And I'm you may not have an answer to this, but as I'm reading the story, I'm like, what the heck? So he gets no combine invite. Fine. There's a lot of talented players that somehow slip through the cracks, don't get the combine. But so him and his agent are like, oh boy, this is a pretty big deal. These combine events and pro day events are an opportunity to display and strut your stuff before the draft, measurements and all kinds of other things. So he requests the other, okay, I can't go to the combine. Let me reach out to people who already having a pro day and let me just hop on along. Not a unique thing whatsoever. I'm here in New York and Syracuse, and every once in a while, we sometimes get Syracuse prospects that are past their glory. Like, let's say they did the pro day in 2018, and then things happen in their life, and they redo their pro day like 2022 or 2023. So, like, that sort of thing happens a lot. But yet he reaches out to Georgia State and Georgia Tech, say, hey, buddy, can I jump on that pro day and be another guy? And They say no. Do you have any idea why the no?
Yeah, it was funny because when I was interviewing Qwan'tez, he was like, "Am I allowed to say this?" And the PR staffer with us was like, "What?" And he's like, "Georgia State said no. Georgia Tech said no. Like they all said no, and I'm gonna make them regret it. They're all gonna pay." And she was like, "Okay, well, you just said it, so we're good." And then his agent ended up telling it to me as well, and a couple other people, maybe one of the scouts I talked to, told me as well. So the idea for the schools is they're invested in getting their guys drafted. Qwan'tez could be a distraction, especially if he's better than some of their guys and he's competition for some of their guys. So you have some school that say either it will be good because we'll bring more NFL scouts, coaches, etc., because of the interest, or it's just like a nice thing to do. But I think it's interesting because I wonder if they would have let him join if he had not gotten an invite to the Shrine Bowl. But once he got an invite to the Shrine Bowl, which is really sort of this threshold of, okay, he did it at the fan-controlled football league, that doesn't really impress anyone. He did it at the CFL level. Okay, well, now it's kind of impressive. Oh, actually, he played really well at the CFL level. Rookie of the year, 5 interceptions from the first game to the last game. He had interceptions. Okay, well, then once he became eligible, you get an all-star invite. But a lot of scouts were thinking he's not going to be able to hold his own. He's going to be intimidated by all these Big Ten college football players. He's going to be intimidated by the pace of the game, by the level of competition, because when you transition from the NFL to the CFL, you have different rules, but you're in theory going against slower, smaller, less athletic guys on balance. In the NFL, you have stronger, quicker, more athletic guys on balance. And so people were concerned that at the Shrine game, that would very much show. And then he balled out at the Shrine game. He had pass deflections in the game, all of that. And so I think after he had that performance in the Shrine game and pretty much every team was like, yeah, we have a draftable grade on him, Georgia State and Georgia Tech were like, yeah, it's probably not best for our players. But it is interesting because there was another scout I talked to from an AFC team, and I was talking to him probably a couple days before this story dropped because I was trying to get a sense of like Qwan'tez's 40 time, which is convoluted because everyone has their own timers and it wasn't official by the league. And he was like, oh, yes, the Jets took him in the 7th round. And this is like end of May. And I was like, no, they took him in the 5th round. He was like, oh, wow, he went in the 5th round. Like people still thought of him as some of those later picks. Now, again, you had different people. The Shrine Bowl director will tell you he could have been in the 3rd round. Guys, I expect him to be a Pro Bowler before I expect him to be out of the league in 3 years. But there were definitely scouts who were concerned about his ability to transition.
Yeah, interesting. Again, we're speaking with Jori gosh darn Epstein here on the program, baby. Again, the full column in the YouTube description. You should have already read it for Pete's sake, but if you haven't, I'm giving you a get out of jail free card. Come around the board, collect $200, and make sure you do it because it's a phenomenal story. And here's something else that stood out to me. So obviously the story is really interesting, and obviously the trades. The Jets didn't draft a charity case here. They think enough of them, of the talent that's here. But from head coach Robert Saleh, defensive coordinator Jeff Ulbrich, other people in the building, when they've been asked about Stiggers, they just kind of stop and say, oh, he's going to make it. And when we're going, well, why? Why do you believe this guy is going to crack? Some 5th-round picks become superstars. Some 5th-round picks don't make their roster. Like, things happen all the time. But why do they? And they just said it's his drive, it's his willpower, his want to. They just believe from those traits alone, let alone all the skills and talents and everything, there's some intangible quality about him that had, of course, all the Jets people emotional during the draft call, and also why they believe he's going to make it. During your conversation with Stiggers, did you pick up on whatever that intangible is? It seems like all the Jets coaches and staffers have.
Yeah, I think it's twofold. I think one, you have scouts and coaches who are telling me that there are some guys who, if they get to this level, they make a mistake, which everyone is going to make a mistake at some point. It's a matter of when, not if. Then they just can't handle it. They can't come back from it. They can't have that next play mentality that's important at every position, and especially at the cornerback position. Well, think about what Qwan'tez has overcome, not just in his life, but in the last 4 years alone. And so these coaches looked at him and they're like, this is not a guy who is going to be intimidated by the challenges and the setbacks of professional football. He's handled worse and he'll be able to handle this. You pair that with the maturity, work ethic, professionalism bucket, and they say, does he know what he needs to know? Absolutely not. Can he do all the skills he needs to succeed and to become a Pro Bowl player tomorrow? No, he's not there yet. But what does he do when he has questions? He stays after practice with Sauce Gardner, and that's something he did the day I was at OTAs. He's staying after meetings, asking coaches, okay, where do I find this film to make sure I can do the extra work? Okay, what do I do on this read? Okay, what's the footwork idea here? He told me, I love this. This actually didn't make it into the final copy of the story. I might do a follow-up on it. When he was on the CFL team, he went to the quarterback's coach, not cornerback, quarterback, as in throwing the ball. And he said, like, hey, can I sit in on y'all's meetings so that I can get a better sense of what you're doing and what you're thinking? And they're like, no. And so he went and he talked to Chad Kelly, who was the starting quarterback at the time, and like talked ball with him. And then he went and talked to Cameron Dukes, Chad's backup at the time, now the starter for the Argos, and talked about it with him. And again, I was in the Cowboys locker room for 7 years. Now I'm jumping around different teams. I've seen quarterbacks sit in offensive line rooms. I've seen quarterbacks pick the defensive coordinator's brain or a defensive coach. I don't remember a time I've seen a DB pick the quarterback's brain consistently. I'm not saying no one ever asked a question, but that's just not typically how they're wired. It's like, how can I go to my craft? And so when you put all that together, I mean, he told me, like, I plan once. He's like, I need to get a little more crap before I start asking Aaron questions. But I do want to ask Aaron how he sees the game. And Aaron really sees the game at an extremely high level, as we all know. And so I think that when you take his ability to overcome things and his determination to not just work hard, but also avail himself of all the resources in a way a lot of players, and especially rookies or first-year players in the NFL, probably wouldn't, I think that's what convinces coaches that this guy's going to make it. And as his agent told me over and over again, like, this is not just a storybook. This is not just a fairy tale. Like, this is a guy who can actually play and actually contribute.
And it feels like that's what Stiggers, was speaking with you about, is like, what's next? What's the next thing here, right? Like, a lot of people are going to see the Stiggers story, go, man, he got drafted, story over. Wow, that was a great movie. Okay, we're going to grab our popcorn and head home. Like, whoa. Stiggers seems, especially with all this Super Bowl conversation thrown around everywhere, especially in Jets land, where that hasn't happened in over 55 gosh darn years, is that doesn't seem like fluff. That seems like a thing he is trying to will into existence.
Right. I think that the super optimist in me would say, when I was watching 11 on 11 at the OTA I was at, there was a play where Rodgers threw downfield to Xavier Gibson. It gets confusing because there's two Gibsons.
Right.
And Qwan'tez was in coverage. He kind of put his arm up. The ball ended up out of bounds, as did the player. And so I was like, well, how much of that was Qwan'tez? How much of that was the offense? It turns out there was something could have been better on the footwork, but he was right there with his play, and the coaches like that. And so on one hand, you can say, like, oh, he's already disrupting passes. He's already forcing the first incompletion of Rodgers' 11 on 11 practice that day, which is accurate. But even if he's not doing that, even if you just say, hey, he didn't really stand out, but that means he didn't stand out for a bad thing. He didn't get burned. Like, the likelihood of him being able to just blend in 11 on 11 on his first day, not going against the third team quarterback, who, by the way, that would be impressive too, given the amount of football Qwan'tez has played. He was able to look like he belonged in a defense going against Aaron Rodgers. I get that it's no contact. I get that we're in the spring part of the season, but from understanding how to play the game, understanding his reactions, understanding the system, which, by the way, is completely new to him, not every guy would be able to do that already. And the coaches would not even try every guy this early in the off-season program, because they would say, like, oh, well, you don't want to lose a guy's confidence. And I don't have to tell Jets fans about what can happen when a player loses confidence. So
that accurate. Yes, Jori. Yes, that quite accurate on that front. And we'll end here. And you already mentioned it a little bit. This is one of my favorite things to do when I have the chance to conversate with a reporter, is that the story you submit to the Yahoo Sports overlords, to the one that gets printed out to us to read on the internet, are not always the same. So that's got to be, I'm sure, tough, because these are all your children. You don't want to, sorry, we're going to slice this piece of the pie. And you're like, geez. I was talking with Zach Rosenblatt about that. He had this big story, Diana Rossetti. It was like 5, 6, 7,000 words. They sliced it down to 3,000. I'm like, oh, yeah, you must have been crying when that was happening, with that going through. That was a great nugget you told already that didn't make the story. Was there anything else from your conversation with Stiggers, or anyone else that you were talking with about Stiggers, that was great, juicy, funny, interesting, but it just didn't make the story, because ultimately that's the editor's jobs and things. They got to cut things down and things of that nature. But anything that didn't make the cut you wish would have?
Yeah, it's such a great question. The quarterback one was definitely one. I'm trying to look through my notes because I think I'd interviewed like 12 or 14 people for the story.
Wow.
Like you were saying, it's sort of like I'll go through all of it. Like you said about it being our kids. I don't get rid of parts of the story. I put them in a cutting board document because I'm like,
Oh, thank goodness.
I
I'm
can't
glad they
stand to
don't
lose
just like
this.
get ditched and you just kind of shoulder shrug, go up. Well, I guess I love that you do that. That's amazing.
I guess another thing I would say that was just sort of a wholesome moment that came up in my interviews is so Tony Oden went down there for a private workout the Monday after his pro day. So I think Qwan'tez had the pro day on a Friday. Tony came and worked him out on Monday. It was footwork and skills, just wanting to make sure, like, hey, if I coach you on something, how well do you retain it and how well can you follow it? And Quan's 2-year-old Quan's 2-year-old son, Legend, apparently like came down to the field and they were worried he was gonna like run out on the field. And instead he just sort of watched his dad. And I know you said you have a 2-year-old daughter, so I'm sure you can appreciate this. Kind of watched, was able to just, he's like, I want to be in the action, but I also know to just like take a step back, like let dad do his work. And I think afterwards he was like showing them how well he could backpedal. And I just thought that was kind of this moment where it's like, think about a few years ago, he wasn't in 2020, he wasn't a father. Quan lost his own father. He lost his profession. And now you have this guy sort of on the brink of reclaiming his profession. And also he's now engaged to his then girlfriend, now fiance. They have a 2-year-old son, and son is getting to watch father and just really be there along the journey as he's being able to support his family after watching his dad leave for shifts at DoorDash and Instacart and selling cars and repairing cars and washing cars and all these different things. And so I thought that was a really wholesome moment. And the last one I'll tell you is when I talked to Quan, I was like, okay, what do you want me to call you? Kind of, you asked me this before we got on the show. How do you pronounce my last name? And I said, do you want Quan? Do you want Tez? Do you want Qwan'tez? Like, I've heard different people call you different things. And he's like, no, I want Quan. I think he went by Tez for a while. And he said now he feels like he's outgrown Tez and Quan is what he's looking for. So for Jets fans wondering how to refer to him casually, that is his preferred way to be referred to.
You know, that's funny that you mentioned that. So again, I'm reading because you're of course promoting your own story on social media and you're doing it, and I catch it and I see that you called him Quan. And I'm like, wow, I haven't seen anyone else call him Quan. Man, Jori and Quan are they're tight. I was like, okay, all right. It's funny that you say that all the way because I was in the back of my head. I was like, all right, I've seen a lot of people do stories on him. That never came up. So, wow, look at you. Okay, Quan, Jet fan. This is official. Boom. I'll have to clip this and send this out to the universe. Quan is the way to do it. Okay. Joy first on the scene on that. Okay, I like it. Well, Jori, again, I've said it several times. I'll scream it a million more. That again, the direct link to Jori's story on Qwan'tez Stiggers is spectacular. You guys can check it out below. Thank you so much for carving out the time. Once I just couldn't get enough. I read the story. I'm like, I need more. There's got to be, more fruits on this tree. I got to take a bite out of. And thank you so much for carving out the time to do so, Jori. This is our first time having you on the show, and hopefully not the last time.
Absolutely. Look forward to joining you again, Paul. I appreciate you reading the story, sharing it with your audience, and thanks so much for having me on.
All right. Well, thank you, Joy, and thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we'll see you next time, everybody. Take